The rain fell upon London with the persistence of sorrow itself, turning the cobblestones to mirrors that reflected a grey and indifferent sky, and it was through this deluge that Miss Evelyn Hartley arrived at Ashford House in the autumn of 1847, her modest trunk strapped to the back of a hired hackney that had seen better days, much like herself. The house rose before her like a monument to austere grandeur, its Portland stone facade gleaming wetly in the dim afternoon light, every window seeming to stare down at her with the same cold assessment she had grown accustomed to receiving from those who had once called her an equal, but now saw only a gentlewoman reduced to accepting paid employment. Evelyn gathered her sodden skirts with hands that trembled only slightly. She had taught herself not to show weakness, not anymore, and allowed the stern-faced butler to usher her into an entrance hall so vast and so meticulously ordered that it felt more like a cathedral to propriety than a home where people actually lived and breathed and felt the messy complications of human existence. She was announced with the formal precision due to any visitor, though they both knew she was no visitor at all but a hired companion, a necessary ornament to attend upon Lady Beatrice Ashford, the Duke's elderly aunt, whose advancing years required the sort of constant attendance that family duty demanded, but family members themselves were too occupied to provide. As she waited, water pooling beneath her worn boots upon marble that surely cost more than her father had lost in his final desperate speculation, Evelyn felt the weight of her transformation settle upon her shoulders like a leaden cloak. She who had once danced at Almack's, who had been called accomplished and pretty in the easy way of young women whose futures seemed assured, now stood in a stranger's hall, hoping only to be deemed acceptable enough to justify the meagre salary that would keep her from complete destitution. The Duke himself appeared at the top of the grand staircase with the sudden inevitability of a storm cloud, and Evelyn's first impression was of severity made flesh. A man, perhaps 35, whose face seemed carved from the same unforgiving stone as his ancestral home, his dark eyes passing over her with an assessment so brief and so utterly devoid of interest that she felt herself dismissed before he had even spoken. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice carrying the particular quality of one who has learned to command without raising his tone, "my aunt will receive you in her sitting-room. Mrs. Pemberton has been delayed in Bath, but will join us next month for the engagement festivities." The words hung in the air with their implicit message he was spoken for, promised to the wealthy and well-connected Lady Caroline Pemberton, and there was no possibility of confusion on that score, no chance that a paid companion might harbour inappropriate thoughts about her employer. Evelyn curtsied with the practised grace that breeding had given her, and poverty could not take away, murmuring her acknowledgment, and as she followed the housekeeper up the stairs, she caught one final glimpse of the Duke, retreating into what must be his study, his shoulders rigid beneath perfectly tailored superfine, and she thought how very much he resembled a man imprisoned in a fortress of his own construction, though she could not have said why the thought occurred to her or why it stirred something uncomfortably close to recognition in her own carefully guarded heart. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. Weeks passed in the careful rhythms of a household that prized order above all else, and Evelyn found herself settling into duties that were simultaneously more pleasant and more isolating than she had anticipated, for Lady Beatrice proved to be a woman of unexpected warmth and formidable intelligence, whose faculties, far from being diminished by her 78 years, remained as sharp as the wit she wielded with surgical precision during their daily conversations. The old woman's sitting-room became Evelyn's sanctuary, a space filled with afternoon light and the comfortable clutter of a life well lived, where she read aloud from novels and journals of natural philosophy, where she played interminable games of chess that Lady Beatrice won with gleeful regularity, and where she listened to stories of a London that had existed before she was born, populated by characters both scandalous and noble, whose descendants now walked the very streets Evelyn had once frequented in happier days. Yet beyond those warm hours, Ashford House remained a monument to rigid formality, every meal a precisely orchestrated performance, every interaction governed by rules so elaborate they seemed designed to prevent any genuine human connection from accidentally occurring. And through it all the Duke moved like a ghost in his own home, present but fundamentally absent. His interactions with Evelyn, limited to the briefest acknowledgements when they passed in corridors or found themselves at the same dinner table with Lady Beatrice between them, like a benevolent chaperone who seemed to find great amusement in observations Evelyn could not quite interpret. She learned to read the household's unspoken language, the way the servants moved with hushed efficiency, the way conversation died when the Duke entered a room, the way his study door remained closed for hours at a time as he attended to the business of estates and investments, and all the weighty responsibilities that came with a dukedom whose history stretched back 3 centuries. Evelyn made herself invisible, or tried to, keeping her eyes downcast and her opinions unspoken except in the privacy of Lady Beatrice's rooms, determined not to presume upon her position or give anyone cause to question her propriety. Yet she could not help but notice the small things that accumulated like snowfall, quiet and persistent, the way the Duke's gaze would sometimes linger on her face during dinner before he caught himself and looked away. The questions he seemed about to ask before thinking better of it, the almost imperceptible softening of his stern features when Lady Beatrice made some clever observation, and Evelyn laughed before she could stop herself. There was something wounded in him, she began to understand. Some deep unhappiness that his perfect posture and controlled expressions could not quite conceal, and she recognized it because she carried her own wounds carefully bandaged beneath the calm competence she presented to the world. The grief of watching her father's slow descent into despair after his investments failed, the humiliation of being pitied by women who had once envied her, the particular loneliness of knowing she would never marry, never have children, never be anything more than a useful appendage to someone else's family. She told herself it did not matter, that she had accepted her fate and made her peace with diminished expectations. But on nights when she lay in her small but comfortable room and listened to the house settling around her, she sometimes allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where birth and fortune had not predetermined every possibility, before she firmly pushed such thoughts away and reminded herself that survival required accepting reality rather than mourning what could never be. The rain returned on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, drumming against the tall windows of Ashford House with a rhythm that matched the restlessness in Evelyn's heart, and seeking respite from the melancholy that seemed to seep through the very walls of her small room, she made her way to the library and that vast repository of leather-bound wisdom that Lady Beatrice had assured her she was welcome to explore during her free hours. She pushed open the heavy oak door as quietly as she could, not wishing to disturb the sacred silence that such rooms seemed to demand, and froze upon the threshold. When she discovered she was not alone, the Duke stood before the windows with his back to her, surrounded by an archipelago of books spread across every available surface, their pages open to illustrations of botanical specimens and astronomical charts, the detritus of a mind seeking answers to questions she could not guess. She began to retreat, murmuring an apology for the intrusion, but he turned at the sound of her voice and something in his expression stopped her, a flash of what might have been relief or perhaps loneliness, quickly masked by his habitual reserve. "Miss Hartley," he said, and his voice lacked its usual formality, roughened slightly as though he had not spoken aloud in hours. "You need not leave. The library is vast enough for 2 solitary souls, I think." She hesitated, caught between propriety's demand that she withdraw and something deeper that urged her to stay. And in that moment of indecision, he gestured to the books surrounding him with a movement that seemed almost helpless. "I have been attempting to understand Humboldt's theories on plant geography," he said, and she heard in his tone an invitation disguised as statement, "but I find his prose rather impenetrable, or perhaps it is merely that my Latin has grown rusty from disuse." Without quite meaning to, Evelyn found herself moving closer, drawn by the unexpected vulnerability of the admission, and she glanced at the open volume before him, recognizing the text from her father's library, sold long ago to pay his debts. "Humboldt writes beautifully," she said, forgetting for a moment to guard her words, "but one must read him slowly, allowing each observation to build upon the last, like watching a landscape reveal itself through clearing mist." The Duke's eyes sharpened with interest, and she saw surprise there, quickly followed by something that looked remarkably like hunger, not for her person but for her mind, for genuine conversation in a house that seemed to prize empty courtesy over authentic exchange. They spoke then, tentatively at first and then with growing ease, about the interconnectedness of natural systems and the beauty of scientific inquiry, about Darwin's voyage, and whether his theories held merit, about the responsibility of those with education to use it for understanding rather than mere social ornament. And Evelyn felt herself unfurling like one of Humboldt's carefully documented plants, expanding toward the light of intellectual engagement she had been starved of since her father's death. The Duke listened to her observations with an attention that felt almost physical in its intensity, occasionally interjecting questions that revealed the sharpness of his own considerable mind, and she watched the severe lines of his face soften incrementally, saw the ghost of the man he might have been before duty and expectation had carved away everything soft and spontaneous. She knew she should feel only gratitude for his condescension in treating her as an equal, if only for this stolen hour. But what she felt instead was far more dangerous, a pull toward him that had nothing to do with his title or his wealth, and everything to do with the wounded intelligence she recognized in his eyes, the same isolation she saw reflected in her own mirror each morning. They did not notice how the afternoon light faded into evening. It did not mark the passage of time until a servant came to light the lamps, and when at last Evelyn remembered herself and curtsied her farewell, she carried with her the warmth of his final words. "I hope you will join me here again, Miss Hartley. It has been far too long since I have had the pleasure of genuinely stimulating conversation." As she made her way back to Lady Beatrice's rooms, her heart beating with a mixture of joy and terror at what had just transpired, she did not see the old woman standing in the darkened doorway she had just passed, watching her retreat with eyes that had witnessed 8 decades of human folly and wisdom, a knowing smile playing across Lady Beatrice's weathered features as she murmured to the empty corridor. And so it begins. Autumn arrived with its particular melancholy beauty, painting the grounds of Ashford House in shades of amber and crimson, and with it came a transformation so gradual that Evelyn could not have said precisely when the library ceased to be merely a room and became instead a sanctuary, an unspoken meeting place where she and the Duke found themselves drawn with increasing regularity, their conversations deepening like roots seeking water in parched soil. They spoke of philosophy and literature, of the reform movement sweeping through Parliament, of scientific discoveries that were reshaping humanity's understanding of its place in the natural world, carefully skirting anything too personal, even as their words revealed more than either quite intended. And Evelyn found herself living for those stolen hours when she could set aside the careful mask of the paid companion and simply be herself, fully present and intellectually engaged in a way she had not been since her father's death. The Duke began seeking her opinions on estate matters, always prefacing his questions with some mention of Lady Beatrice's interest, as though he needed to justify consulting a woman of no particular standing, but they both knew the pretense was wearing thin, and Evelyn saw in his eyes a hunger that matched her own, a desperate need for authentic connection in a life that had been carefully constructed to prevent precisely such dangerous intimacy. Small gestures accumulated like interest on an investment, a volume of Wordsworth's poetry left on her usual chair, its spine still crisp and unbroken, clearly purchased rather than taken from the existing collection, with a particular sonnet marked by a ribbon of deep blue silk. The poem speaking of solitude, and the unexpected joy of finding kindred spirits in unlikely circumstances. She read it 3 times in the privacy of her room, her hands trembling as she traced the words, knowing she should return it, knowing she should distance herself from whatever was blossoming between them like some impossible winter flower. Yet she found herself carrying it with her the next day, found herself thanking him with eyes that said far more than her carefully chosen words could safely convey. The household began to notice, of course, for servants saw everything and the Duke's transformation was impossible to miss. He smiled more readily, lingered over meals instead of retreating immediately to his study, asked questions about the staff's families with genuine interest, where before he had moved through his own home like a stranger merely visiting, and Evelyn heard the whispered speculation in corridors, saw the knowing glances exchanged when she passed, felt the weight of observation that made her increasingly conscious of every gesture, every word, every moment they spent together. Yet it was the observations of Lady Caroline that troubled her most deeply, for during one of his fiancée's brief visits to the house, Evelyn witnessed the profound emptiness of their engagement, saw how Lady Caroline treated the Duke with a bored tolerance that bordered on contempt, speaking to him as one might address a particularly slow servant. Her interest engaged only when discussing the financial arrangements of their upcoming union or the guest list for the engagement ball that would formalize what was already a foregone conclusion in society's eyes. At dinner that evening, Evelyn sat in her usual place at the far end of the table, meant to be present but invisible, a piece of furniture with pulse and breath, and she watched as Lady Caroline held forth on the inadequacies of the previous season's fashions, while the Duke sat silent and rigid, his face a mask of polite attention, and then his eyes found Evelyn's across the expanse of white linen and crystal, and in that look she read such profound unhappiness, such desperate longing for rescue from a fate he had accepted but never chosen, that she had to look away before the tears gathering in her throat could betray her. That night, lying sleepless in her narrow bed, Evelyn made a decision born of equal parts wisdom and cowardice. She would distance herself and would protect both their hearts by retreating into the proper boundaries of her position, would remember that wanting something did not make it possible, and that some chasms could not be bridged, no matter how strong the desire. She began taking her meals in her room, citing headaches and fatigue, avoided the library during the hours she knew he favored, kept her interactions with Lady Beatrice to the old woman's chambers, where she would be safe from accidental encounters, and she felt herself withering like one of Humboldt's documented specimens, deprived of essential light. But she told herself it was necessary, it was right. It was the only way to prevent the catastrophe she could see approaching with the inevitability of winter following autumn. The unseasonable warmth arrived on a Wednesday morning in late October, a gift from some capricious deity who had taken pity on England's usually relentless autumn chill, and the Duke noticed her absence with an acuteness that surprised him. For 3 days had passed without sight of Miss Hartley in the library or at meals, and the house felt emptier for her withdrawal, as though some essential light had been extinguished, leaving only the cold, formal brightness of chandeliers and duty. He found Lady Beatrice in the morning room, her sharp eyes watching him over the rim of her teacup, with an expression that suggested she knew precisely what he was about to ask before he spoke the words, and when he mentioned, perhaps a walk in the gardens might do his aunt some good on such a fine day, might she enjoy Miss Hartley's company as well? The old woman's smile was knowing and indulgent, as she agreed with alacrity that seemed suspiciously rehearsed. Evelyn received the invitation with visible reluctance, her face carefully neutral as she helped Lady Beatrice into her walking cloak, and the Duke felt the distance she had erected between them, like a physical barrier, a wall built of propriety and fear that he longed to scale but had no right to breach. They set out along the gravel paths that wound through the formal gardens, the 3 of them walking in careful formation with Lady Beatrice between them, and they had progressed perhaps 50 yards when the old woman stopped abruptly, pressing a hand to her chest with a theatrical delicacy that would have been amusing had the Duke not been so desperate for the opportunity her sudden fatigue presented. She insisted she must return to the house immediately, but that the 2 of them should should enjoy this rare gift of warmth before winter claimed its dominion, and before either could protest, she was making her way back toward the terrace, with a sprightliness that rather belied her claimed exhaustion, leaving them alone beneath the turning leaves. They walked in silence at first, the awkwardness between them palpable, until the Duke could bear it no longer, and spoke of inconsequential things, the gardens, the weather, the estate's preparations for winter, anything to hear her voice again, and gradually she responded, her words tentative but warming, and somehow their conversation turned toward loss, toward the burdens they each carried, and he found himself speaking of his father's deathbed commands, the engagement arranged when he was barely 17 to a girl he had never met, the weight of expectation that had slowly crushed every spontaneous impulse until he had become more monument than man. Evelyn listened with an attention that felt like absolution, and when she spoke of her own tragedy, her father's gambling debts, her mother's death from the shame of it, in her brother's disappearance to the colonies, the slow dismantling of everything she had known and loved, he heard in her voice an echo of his own quiet desperation, and he understood that they were both prisoners of circumstance, both trapped in cages they had not built but could not seem to escape. They had stopped walking without quite noticing, standing beneath an ancient oak whose leaves drifted down around them like gilded snow, and in that moment something passed between them that was not quite touch but felt more intimate than any physical contact could have been, their hands rising almost of their own volition, drawn together by some magnetic force neither could name, And then reality intruded with the distant sound of voices from the house, and they both stepped back sharply. The spell broken but not forgotten, and they resumed walking with careful distance between them, speaking now of safer topics, yet both knew that something fundamental had shifted, that a line had been crossed from which there could be no real retreat. And when they parted at the terrace steps with formal courtesies that felt like lies, Evelyn carried with her the weight of possibility and the terror of hope, while the Duke stood watching her retreat with the awful certainty that he had found the one person in all the world who understood him, and that duty would require him to let her go. Lady Caroline arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early November, her carriage and four, accompanied by 2 additional vehicles, bearing her lady's maid, her trunks, her hat boxes, and all the accoutrements necessary for an extended stay. And Evelyn watched from Lady Beatrice's window as the procession drew up before the house, with a sense of impending doom settling over her like morning frost. The woman who emerged was beautiful in the cold, classical manner that society so admired, all golden curls and porcelain skin, and a figure that expensive dressmakers had sculpted into the ideal silhouette. But there was something in the set of her mouth, the calculation in her pale blue eyes, that spoke of a nature more concerned with acquisition than affection, and Evelyn felt her heart contract with a painful mixture of jealousy and pity for the Duke, who would spend his life beside such exquisite emptiness. Lady Caroline's treatment of the household staff was imperious, bordering on cruel, her commands delivered with the casual disdain of one who had never questioned her own superiority, and when she encountered Evelyn in the corridor outside Lady Beatrice's chambers, her gaze swept over her with the dismissive assessment one might give to a piece of furniture being considered for removal, and she addressed her only to inquire whether she was the companion, speaking the word as though it tasted faintly unpleasant on her tongue. The Duke's fiancée treated him with a bored tolerance that was somehow worse than active dislike, speaking to him with the patronizing tone one might use with a moderately clever child. Her interest engaged only when discussing the guest list for their engagement ball or the terms of the marriage settlement, and Evelyn observed that Lady Caroline called him Ashford, never using his Christian name, maintaining even in private moments the formal distance of a business arrangement. The dinner that evening proved an exquisite torture, for Evelyn sat in her accustomed place at the far end of the table, while Lady Caroline held forth on the inadequacies of the current season's offerings at the opera, the disappointing quality of the previous week's ball at the Worthington estate, the shocking decline in standards among the younger set who seemed to think that passion was an acceptable substitute for propriety, all while the Duke sat rigid and silent, his responses monosyllabic when required, his face a mask of polite attention that Evelyn now recognized as the armor he wore against a world that demanded everything and offered nothing in return. She felt his eyes seeking hers across the expanse of crystal and silver, felt the weight of his gaze like a physical touch, and she saw in that look such desperate unhappiness, such longing for rescue from a fate he had accepted but never chosen, that she had to focus all her attention on her plate, lest the tears gathering in her throat betray her. And when Lady Caroline noticed the Duke's distraction and followed his gaze to where Evelyn sat, there was a flash of something calculating in those pale eyes, a predator's awareness of potential threat, and Evelyn knew with awful certainty that she had been marked and measured and found wanting in all the ways that mattered to such a woman. That night she made her decision with the clarity of desperation. She would protect them both by retreating fully into the proper boundaries of her position, would remember that some chasms could not be bridged regardless of desire, would save him from the catastrophe of his own generous heart by removing herself from temptation. And so she began taking her meals in her room, claiming headaches and fatigue, avoided the library during the hours she knew he favored, kept her interactions with Lady Beatrice confined to the old woman's chambers, where she would be safe from accidental encounters. And the Duke noticed her absence immediately. She knew, for she saw the books that appeared outside her door with increasing frequency, saw the questions in Lady Beatrice's knowing eyes, felt the house itself seem to hold its breath, waiting for something to shatter, but she held firm to her resolution, even as she felt herself withering, like a plant deprived of essential light, telling herself it was necessary, it was right, it was the only way to prevent the ruin she could see approaching with the inevitability of winter following autumn. The Duke found her in the conservatory at nearly midnight, drawn there by some instinct he could not name, and she stood among the ferns and orchids like a ghost in her pale nightdress, covered modestly by a wrapper, her dark hair loose about her shoulders in a way he had never seen, and the sight of her thus unguarded struck him with such force that he forgot for a moment why he had been searching the house, room by room, in growing desperation, until he remembered that she had been absent from his life for 9 days, that he could not endure another hour of this self-imposed exile she had erected between them. She startled when she heard his footsteps, turning with eyes wide and luminous in the lamplight she had brought with her, and he saw that she had been crying, her face marked with the evidence of tears she had thought private, and when she moved to flee past him, he stepped into her path with an urgency that bordered on impropriety, his voice rough as he demanded to know why she was avoiding him, what he had done to deserve this sudden withdrawal, and she drew herself up with all the dignity she could muster and spoke of propriety, as of her position, of the unseemliness of their growing friendship, given his upcoming marriage, each word carefully chosen and utterly unconvincing even to her own ears. His frustration erupted then in a way she had never witnessed, his careful control shattering like crystal against stone, as he told her he cared nothing for propriety when it meant losing the only genuine connection he had known in years, that her absence had transformed the house into a mausoleum, and himself into a corpse going through the motions of living, and then the words that changed everything spilled from him unbidden and irrevocable. "I cannot bear these pretenses any more, in this charade of indifference, when you have become the very air I breathe," and Evelyn felt the ground shift beneath her feet, as she understood with terrifying clarity that he shared her feelings, that she was not alone in this impossible longing, and the knowledge was simultaneously the most wonderful and most devastating revelation of her life. She stepped back as though his words had physical weight, her hand rising to her throat in a gesture of unconscious defense, and she told him with shaking voice that it did not matter what they felt, and that feelings changed nothing about the reality of their circumstances, that he was promised to another, and she was nobody, nothing, a paid companion without fortune or family or any claim to consideration, and to pursue this path would destroy them both, would make her the scarlet woman of scandal, and him the faithless nobleman who broke his word for lust disguised as love. The Duke moved toward her then, with the slow deliberation of a man approaching something precious and fragile, and he spoke of honor twisted into chains, of duty that demanded the sacrifice of every genuine impulse, of the difference between keeping one's word to a contract and honoring the deeper truth of one's heart. But even as he spoke, she could see the war raging within him, the gentleman's training battling against the man's desperate need, and she knew that whatever he chose in this moment would define the course of both their lives. She told him he must go, must leave her there among the plants and shadows, must return to his chambers and his fiancée and his proper life, and she would find another position far from London, where she could recover from this madness that had seized them both. But he stood immobile as though her words were rain that could not touch him, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried such anguish that she felt it like a blade between her ribs. He asked if she truly believed distance would erase what they had found, if she thought herself capable of forgetting these weeks of perfect understanding, if she could honestly imagine a future in which they did not ache for what might have been, and she could not answer because they both knew the truth, even if neither dared speak it aloud. They stood thus suspended in the humid air of the conservatory, surrounded by living green things that knew nothing of human complications, and finally the Duke turned and walked away without another word, his shoulders rigid with the effort of leaving, and Evelyn remained among the orchids until dawn began to grey the windows, her tears falling silently onto leaves that would hold the salt of her grief until the gardener came to water them away, both of them shaken to their foundations by truths acknowledged but unresolved, by possibilities glimpsed but not grasped, by the terrible recognition that some chasms cannot be bridged by desire alone, no matter how fierce the longing that spans them. Lady Beatrice fell ill 3 days after the conservatory confrontation, and the household woke to find her fevered and struggling for breath, her aged body suddenly fragile as parchment, and the physician summoned from London spoke in grave tones of inflammation of the lungs and the particular dangers such ailments pose to the elderly, and Evelyn moved into the sick-room without question or hesitation, all thoughts of propriety and self-preservation abandoned in the face of genuine crisis. for whatever complicated feelings existed between herself and the Duke. Her affection for Lady Beatrice was pure and uncomplicated, the old woman having shown her kindness when the world offered only diminishment. The days blurred into nights and nights into days, as Evelyn kept vigil by the bedside, sponging Lady Beatrice's fevered brow, coaxing spoonfuls of broth past cracked lips, reading aloud in a steady voice even when the old woman seemed too far lost in delirium to hear, and the Duke kept vigil as well, appearing at odd hours to relieve Evelyn's watch, though she rarely left the room, and in those hushed hours between midnight and dawn, when the world seemed reduced to the circle of lamplight around the sickbed and the laboured sound of Lady Beatrice's breathing, they spoke to each other with the honesty that exhaustion and fear made possible, their usual guards lowered by shared concern for this woman they both loved. It was during one such night, while Lady Beatrice slept fitfully and the fire burned low in the grate, and that the Duke confessed the truth about his engagement, how his father on his deathbed had extracted a promise that his son would marry Lady Caroline Pemberton, how the arrangement had been negotiated when he was barely 20 and she 17, how he had spent the intervening years trying to convince himself that duty could be enough, that affection might grow where passion was absent, but he had learned instead that some unions were merely elegant tombs in which two people buried themselves alive. And Evelyn listened with tears sliding silently down her cheeks as she understood the full weight of the chains he wore. She spoke then of her own fears, of how her family's fall from grace had taught her that scandal was a living death from which there was no resurrection, of how she had watched her mother wither under society's condemnation after her father's financial ruin and subsequent suicide, of how she had sworn never to be the cause of such suffering for another, and the Duke reached across the space between their chairs to take her hand in his, and neither pulled away this time, because Lady Beatrice's illness had stripped away the luxury of pretense and left only the essential truth of their connection. Lady Beatrice herself, in her moments of lucidity, watched them with eyes that missed nothing despite the fever's haze, and once when Evelyn was adjusting her pillows, the old woman caught her wrist with surprising strength and whispered in a voice like dry leaves, "Some cages are of our own making. Child, we forge the bars from fear and call it wisdom. But wisdom knows the difference between caution and cowardice." And Evelyn understood that Lady Beatrice had perceived everything, had perhaps orchestrated certain moments with the deliberate maneuvering of one who had lived long enough to recognize love when it bloomed and to know its rarity. And when Evelyn tried to protest the impossibility of their situation, Lady Beatrice silenced her with a look of such fierce conviction that argument died on her lips, and the old woman said, "I did not survive 73 years on this earth to watch my nephew destroy himself for propriety's sake, while you flee from the only happiness either of you may ever know." And then she drifted back into fevered sleep, leaving Evelyn shaken by the recognition that even Lady Beatrice, whose opinion she valued above almost all others, believed some rules were meant to be broken when the alternative was a lifetime of regret. Lady Beatrice recovered slowly over the following weeks, her resilience a testament to a will that refused to surrender even when her body seemed determined to fail. And as colour returned to her cheeks and strength to her limbs, the household breathed easier, though the crisis had left its mark on everyone who had lived through those terrifying days of uncertainty, and none felt the aftermath more acutely than the Duke and Evelyn, who had spoken truths in the darkness that could not be unspoken in the light, and who now moved through the halls of Ashford House with a new awareness that made every accidental encounter feel weighted with significance, and every avoided glance an acknowledgement of all that remained unresolved between them. The engagement ball loomed 3 weeks distant, its approach marked by an increasing flurry of preparations that transformed the house into a stage for the performance of a union neither party desired, and the Duke grew steadily more withdrawn as the date approached, his face settling into lines of grim resignation that Evelyn recognized as the expression of a man preparing himself for a lifetime of honorable misery, and she understood with aching clarity that he would go through with the marriage, because duty was the language he had been taught from birth, and breaking his word seemed to him a betrayal of everything his position demanded, even if keeping it meant betraying his heart. She made her decision in the grey light of dawn after another sleepless night, sitting at the small writing desk in her chamber with paper before her and pen in hand, and she composed careful letters of inquiry to agencies that placed governesses and companions in households far from London, choosing positions in Scotland and the north of England, where distance might provide the mercy of forgetting. And she told herself that leaving after the ball was an act of kindness to them both, that removing the source of temptation would allow the Duke to settle into his marriage without the constant reminder of what he had sacrificed, though in her most honest moments she knew she was also fleeing from her own weakness because she did not trust herself to remain near him while he belonged to another. Lady Caroline arrived for an extended stay to oversee the final preparations, her presence filling the house with an imperious energy that seemed to suck warmth from every room she entered, and she had begun to notice the Duke's distraction, with an irritation that manifested in increasingly sharp demands for his attention and increasingly pointed remarks about household management and the proper ordering of servants, and her suspicion, though not yet fixed on any particular object, was growing into something dangerous. The confrontation came during afternoon tea in the drawing-room where Lady Beatrice, still weak but insisting on resuming normal activities, presided over the gathering with Evelyn in quiet attendance, and Lady Caroline holding forth on the guest list for the ball with the certainty of one who expected her pronouncements to be received as law. And when Evelyn rose to fetch Lady Beatrice's shawl from the nearby chair, Lady Caroline said in a voice pitched to carry, "Really, one would think a paid companion might anticipate her employer's needs rather than requiring direction, like a common housemaid, though I suppose we cannot expect proper training from someone of such diminished circumstances, and the casual cruelty of it." The deliberate humiliation delivered with a smile hung in the air like poison, while the Duke's teacup rattled against its saucer with the force of his barely contained rage, and Lady Beatrice's eyes flashed with indignation, though Evelyn herself maintained perfect composure as she retrieved the shawl and arranged it around Lady Beatrice's shoulders with gentle hands, her face serene, though the Duke could see the faint tremor in her fingers and the too careful control of her expression, and he knew in that moment, watching her absorb cruelty with dignity, while his fiancée sat smiling at her own wit, that he could not do this, could not condemn them both to this half-life of proximity and pretense, and something fundamental shifted in him as he set down his cup with deliberate precision and excused himself from the room before he said something that could not be unsaid, leaving the women in a silence that crackled with unspoken tensions, while Evelyn stood behind Lady Beatrice's chair and felt the future she had been trying to accept crumble into impossibility. Winter's first snow fell on the morning the Duke found Evelyn's resignation letter on his desk, the delicate script informing him with painful formality that she had accepted a position as governess to a family in Edinburgh and would be departing immediately following the engagement ball, giving him 2 weeks' notice as propriety demanded, though they both knew propriety had long since ceased to govern the true nature of their relationship, and he stood in his study holding the paper in hands that trembled with something beyond rage or grief, some combination of devastation and clarity that felt like waking from a long sleep into brilliant, painful light, and he understood in that crystallizing moment that he had been moving through his life as though it were a carefully choreographed performance in which he played the role assigned to him by birth and expectation, while his actual self remained locked away in some deep interior room, and the thought of Evelyn leaving, of spending the rest of his existence in the elegant prison of his marriage to Lady Caroline, while the only woman who had ever truly seen him disappeared into the Scottish wilderness, transformed his paralysis into something approaching rage against the forces that demanded such sacrifices on the altar of duty and decorum. He found Lady Beatrice in her sitting room that evening after the household had retired. The old woman still awake despite the late hour, as though she had been expecting him, and when he entered, she looked up from her book with eyes that held such knowing compassion that he felt his carefully maintained composure threatened to crack entirely, and he sank into the chair across from her and said without preamble, "She is leaving," and Lady Beatrice nodded slowly and replied, "I know." "Nephew, did you think I would not notice her quiet inquiries, her careful avoidance of any discussion of the future?" And there was no judgment in her voice, only a gentleness that invited confession. And so he told her everything, the full truth of what he felt for Evelyn and what he knew she felt for him, the impossibility of their situation and the equal impossibility of continuing as they were. And Lady Beatrice listened without interruption until his words ran dry and silence settled between them like snow accumulating on windowsills. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of her 73 years and the wisdom accumulated through a lifetime of observing human nature in all its complexity, and she said, "Your father loved you, William, and he wanted your happiness, even if his methods were misguided. This engagement he arranged was meant to secure your future, to ensure you would never know the financial uncertainty that plagued his own youth, but he could not have foreseen that in protecting you from one kind of suffering he would condemn you to another." And the Duke felt tears sting his eyes at this interpretation of his father's deathbed demand, this possibility that duty and love might not have been the opposing forces he had always believed them to be. And Lady Beatrice continued, "Honor without happiness is merely pride, nephew, a cold virtue that warms no hearth and comforts no heart, and your father would want you to live, not merely exist in the mausoleum of respectability." And she reached across the space between them to take his hand in hers, her grip surprisingly strong despite her recent illness, and she said with fierce conviction, "Break the engagement, yes. There will be scandal and condemnation. Society will sharpen its knives and feast on your perceived failure, but scandals fade, and society's memory is mercifully short, while a lifetime of regret endures until your final breath, and I will not sit by and watch you destroy yourself and that remarkable young woman for the sake of an arrangement that serves no one's true interests." The Duke felt something fundamental shift within him, the bars of his self-imposed cage falling away as Lady Beatrice's blessing released him from the vow he had believed unbreakable, and he knew with sudden certainty what he must do. He would speak to Lady Caroline, dissolve the engagement, regardless of consequences, and then he would go to Evelyn and offer her not the hidden half-life of secret affection, but the full, honest future they both deserved, and damn society's judgment, because some things were worth any price. The Duke requested a private audience with Lady Caroline the following afternoon, sending a formal note that conveyed the gravity of what he intended, though not its precise nature, and she arrived at his study with an expression of vague irritation, as though his summons had interrupted more pleasant pursuits, settling herself in the chair across from his desk with the casual assumption of one who believed herself entirely secure in her position and wholly unaware that the ground beneath her was about to shift fundamentally. He had rehearsed various openings during the sleepless hours of the previous night, crafting speeches that attempted to soften the blow or justify his decision through elaborate explanations of duty versus happiness, but when he looked at her across the expanse of polished mahogany, all those careful phrases seemed suddenly hollow and dishonest, and so he spoke with a directness that surprised them both, saying simply, "Lady Caroline, I cannot marry you, I do not love you, and I believe you do not love me. And to proceed with this union would be a cruelty to us both that I can no longer justify regardless of the consequences that may follow from its dissolution." He had expected rage or tears and had braced himself for accusations and recriminations, for the full force of wounded pride and social humiliation to crash over him like a wave. But instead, Lady Caroline sat very still for a long moment, her face cycling through expressions he could not quite read, surprise certainly, but also something that looked almost like relief, and when she finally spoke, her voice held none of the fury he had anticipated, but rather a strange calm that suggested she had been waiting for this conversation without quite knowing it. She said, "I wondered when you would find the courage." And at his startled expression she continued, "Did you think I was blind to your feelings for Miss Hartley, or to your increasing misery? As our wedding approached, I have watched you these past months transform from merely distant to actively tormented, and while my vanity might prefer to believe it was reluctance to marry me specifically, I am not so foolish as to mistake duty-bound resignation for anything resembling affection." And there was no bitterness in her words, only a pragmatic acknowledgement of their situation that felt almost liberating after so many weeks of pretense. The Duke found himself leaning forward, studying his fiancée, soon-to-be former fiancée, with genuine curiosity, for perhaps the first time since their engagement had been arranged, seeing past the beautiful mask of society propriety to the woman beneath, and he asked, "You are not angry?" And she laughed, a sound without humor but also without malice, and said, "Angry? No, William. I am relieved. I have been conducting a correspondence with a naval officer stationed in Portsmouth, a gentleman of modest means and no particular social standing, but possessed of qualities I find far more appealing than a dukedom, and our letters have progressed to declarations that make this engagement feel less like security and more like a prison sentence. Her confession hung in the air between them, this mutual acknowledgement that they had both been trapped by expectations neither had chosen, and the Duke felt an unexpected kinship with this woman he had never truly known, this stranger to whom he had been preparing to bind himself for the sake of appearances and family obligations, and he understood that they were both victims of the same system that valued position over passion and propriety over personal happiness. They sat together in companionable silence for several minutes, two people who had been preparing to commit legal and spiritual fraud by speaking vows they did not mean. And then they began to plan the dissolution of their engagement with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized its formation, agreeing on a narrative that would protect both their reputations by suggesting a mutual and amicable recognition of incompatibility discovered before irreversible vows were spoken. And though they both knew society would speculate and gossip regardless, at least this version offered them some measure of dignity and control over a situation that could easily spiral into scandal. When Lady Caroline finally rose to leave, she paused at the door and said with unexpected warmth, "I hope you find happiness with her, William. Miss Hartley seems a woman of genuine quality, and you deserve better than the half-life we would have created together." And he thanked her with equal sincerity, watching as she departed with shoulders straight and head high, already transforming their broken engagement into a story of mature decision-making rather than failed obligation. And he felt the last chains of his father's dying wish fall away as he realized that honor could take many forms, and that sometimes the most honorable choice was the one that acknowledged human limitation and chose authentic feeling over hollow performance. The announcement appeared in the Times 3 days later, a carefully worded statement declaring that the Duke of Ashford and Lady Caroline Pemberton had reached a mutual understanding that their temperaments were not suited for matrimony, and had therefore dissolved their engagement by mutual consent with the blessing of both families. But despite the diplomatic phrasing and Lady Caroline's own confirmation of the arranged narrative, society seized upon the broken engagement with the ravenous delight of those who had been starved of genuine scandal during a particularly dull season, and within hours the drawing rooms of London blazed with speculation about what had truly transpired behind the polished facade of aristocratic propriety. Lady Caroline's family, the Pembertons, proved less cooperative than she had hoped, her father in particular viewing the dissolution as a stain upon his daughter's reputation, regardless of her private relief, and he began making pointed remarks at his club about the Duke's ungentlemanly conduct and the suspicious timing of his change of heart, remarks that metastasized through London's interconnected social networks, like poison spreading through water until everyone was whispering about some unknown cause that must have precipitated such a dramatic reversal. Evelyn's name surfaced on the fourth day, mentioned first in a letter from Lady Pemberton to a friend who promptly shared it with her entire acquaintance. The phrase "that paid companion" delivered with such venom that it required no further elaboration to convey its meaning, and suddenly the narrative shifted from mutual understanding to something far more damaging: the fortuneless nobody who had bewitched the Duke, the scheming governess who had destroyed a perfectly suitable match, the woman who had forgotten her place and reached above her station with calculated feminine wiles. The household staff at Ashford House found themselves subjected to interrogations from visiting ladies who claimed social calls, but clearly sought confirmation of the rumors, asking pointed questions about Miss Hartley's duties and the Duke's attentions with barely concealed eagerness for damning details. And though the senior servants remained loyal and tight-lipped, their very defensiveness suggested there was indeed something to defend, which only fanned the flames of speculation until Evelyn could feel the weight of society's judgment pressing against the house like gathering storm clouds. She heard the whispers during a necessary trip to the modiste to collect Lady Beatrice's altered gowns, the shop girls falling silent when she entered, then resuming their conversation in voices just loud enough to ensure she heard every cruel word about presumptuous companions and ruined dukes and the wages of ambition beyond one's birth, and she stood frozen in the shop's entrance, with her cheeks burning and her hands trembling, as she understood with crystalline horror that she had become exactly what she had feared: the scandal that would define the Duke's life, the mistake that would haunt his reputation, the evidence that he had allowed passion to overcome judgment and duty. That evening, she made her decision with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through her family's disgrace and her acceptance of her diminished station, understanding that the only way to protect the Duke from further damage was to remove herself entirely from his sphere and to disappear so completely that society would eventually forget her name and remember only that the Duke had briefly lost his head before recovering his senses. And she began packing her belongings in the small hours after midnight, when the household slept and no one would witness her preparations or ask questions she could not bear to answer. She took only what she had brought with her those months ago when she had first arrived at Ashford House, leaving behind the small gifts the Duke had given her, the books, the shawl, the pressed flowers from their garden walk, because they belonged to a dream that had never been hers to claim. And as she folded her few dresses and placed them in her worn traveling case, she felt tears sliding down her cheeks for the loss of what might have been if the world were different, if birth and fortune did not matter, if love alone could be sufficient foundation for a life together. Her plan was simple. She would leave at dawn before the household stirred, would take the public coach to her cousin's home in Yorkshire, where she could disappear into obscurity as an unpaid companion to elderly relatives. And she would carry the memory of these months like a precious jewel locked away in some deep interior place where it could sustain her through whatever colorless years remained. She had left a letter for the Duke on her pillow, explaining her departure as necessary for his protection and begging him not to follow or seek her out because she could not bear to be the instrument of his destruction, and another briefer note for Lady Beatrice thanking her for kindness and understanding. And as the first grey light of winter dawn began to filter through her window, she picked up her case and moved toward the door, her heart breaking even as her resolve remained firm, choosing his future over her happiness, because that was what love demanded when the world left no other honorable choice. The Duke woke with a start in the depths of night, pulled from uneasy dreams by some instinct he could not name, and he lay in the darkness of his chamber with his heart racing, as though his body understood what his conscious mind had not yet grasped, that something was profoundly wrong, that the woman he loved was slipping away, even as he tried to hold on to the hope that had sustained him through these difficult days since the engagement's dissolution. He rose and pulled on his dressing gown, moving through the silent corridors of Ashford House with a growing sense of urgency that propelled him first to the library where they had spent so many precious hours, finding it empty and cold, then to the conservatory where moonlight filtered through glass onto abandoned plants, and finally, driven by desperation, toward the servants' wing, where Evelyn's modest chamber lay tucked away from the grand apartments of the family and their noble guests. Her door stood slightly ajar, and even before he pushed it fully open, he knew what he would find: the stripped bed, the empty wardrobe, the absence of all those small personal items that had made the room hers, and there on the pillow lay 2 letters in her careful script, one bearing his name and one Lady Beatrice's, and he snatched up his own with trembling hands, while his mind raced through possibilities of where she might have gone, how long ago she had left, whether he could still reach her before she disappeared forever into the vast anonymity of England's coaching roads and distant counties. He read her words standing in the doorway of her abandoned room, each sentence a knife to his heart, as she explained her departure as necessary for his protection, begged him not to follow, insisted that she could not bear to be the instrument of his destruction. And the noble self-sacrifice that animated every line only made him more certain that he could not let her go, that a life purchased at the cost of her absence would be no life at all but merely existence, a slow death of the heart that would leave him as hollow and severe as he had been before she brought light into his carefully ordered darkness. He dropped the letter and began a frantic search of the house, checking every room where she might have sought temporary refuge, questioning the few servants already stirring in the pre-dawn hours who reported seeing no one, until finally he reached the servants' entrance and found her there in the grey half-light of approaching morning, her worn travelling case beside her on the floor, her cloak wrapped tight against the winter cold, her face pale and resolute as she waited for the public coach that would carry her away from him forever. She startled when she saw him, her eyes widening with something that looked like pain mixed with longing, and she said, "Please don't," before he could speak, her voice breaking on the words, but he crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and took her hands in his. not caring that they stood in full view of any servant who might pass, not caring about propriety or station or the scandal that already swirled around their names like poisonous smoke. He said, "I love you, Evelyn. I love you with every part of myself that was dead before you came here, and I cannot let you sacrifice yourself on the altar of my reputation when that reputation without you is worthless, when a life lived in society's good graces, but without your presence, would be a betrayal of everything we have found together." She was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks as she shook her head and insisted, "I will ruin you, William. I already have. The scandal will follow you forever, and every door that closes will be my fault. Every snub and whisper will be because you chose me over duty." But he pulled her closer and said with fierce conviction, "Let them talk, let them condemn. Let them close every door in London. I choose you, Evelyn. I choose life over death of the heart. I choose the woman who sees me truly over the society that sees only title and expectation, and we will face whatever comes together, or not at all." She searched his face in the growing light, looking for doubt or hesitation, finding only absolute certainty, and he watched as her resistance crumbled, as fear gave way to hope, as the careful walls she had built to protect them both finally collapsed under the weight of acknowledged love, and when she finally whispered, yes, it was both surrender and victory, both ending and beginning, and he gathered her into his arms there in the servants' entrance, as dawn broke over London and the first birds began their morning songs, holding her as though he could shield her from all the cruelty and judgment that would surely come, promising in a voice rough with emotion that they would emerge from this trial with heads high and hearts intact, that their love would prove stronger than society's condemnation, that together they would build a life founded on truth rather than pretense, on genuine feeling rather than hollow obligation. And she clung to him and let herself believe, let herself hope, let herself trust that perhaps love could indeed be sufficient foundation for a future, despite all the world's insistence to the contrary. The Duke made his intentions devastatingly clear 1 week after Evelyn's aborted departure, when he secured a box at the Royal Opera House for the season's most anticipated performance of La Traviata, and arrived with Evelyn on his arm, dressed in a gown he had commissioned from London's finest modiste in rich sapphire silk that transformed her from paid companion into a woman who belonged at a duke's side, and the moment they appeared in the theatre's grand entrance, the conversation stopped mid-sentence, as every eye turned to witness this brazen confirmation of the rumors that had set society ablaze. Evelyn felt the weight of those stares like physical blows as they ascended the sweeping staircase toward their box, heard the whispered insults that followed in their wake, shameless, fortune hunter above her station, delivered in voices calculated to reach her ears while maintaining a veneer of discretion, and she fought the instinct to flee back to the safety of Ashford House, where she could hide from this public judgment. But the Duke's hand remained steady at the small of her back, as his presence beside her, a bulwark against the cruelty, and she drew strength from his unwavering composure, even as her own courage threatened to crumble. They took their seats in full view of the assembly just as the curtain rose, and throughout the first act, Evelyn was acutely aware of the opera glasses trained on their box rather than the stage, society more interested in observing the scandalous Duke and his inappropriate companion than in Verdi's tragic tale of a courtesan's doomed love, and during the interval, the true assault began, when several ladies made a point of cutting them directly, turning away with theatrical disdain, when the Duke attempted civil greetings, their husbands following suit with expressions of contempt that left no doubt about their opinion of a peer who would bring his paramour into respectable company. The Duke's fury at these calculated insults manifested not in words but in deliberate tenderness, his hand finding Evelyn's and holding it openly in defiance of propriety, his attention focused entirely on her, as though the rest of the theatre's inhabitants had ceased to exist, and this public display of genuine affection proved more effective than any angry response could have been, forcing some observers to confront the uncomfortable reality that what they witnessed was not casual dalliance but profound devotion. Lady Beatrice arrived during the second interval, having secured her own box for precisely this purpose, and she made a grand production of visiting theirs, embracing Evelyn warmly and conversing with her nephew in tones loud enough to carry to neighboring boxes, her aged but still formidable presence lending legitimacy to their relationship and reminding society that the Duke's own family supported this match, regardless of its unconventional nature. Then came the moment that shifted the evening's tenor, when Lady Caroline Pemberton herself appeared in the corridor outside their box, resplendent in emerald silk, and accompanied by her naval officer, now openly acknowledged as her intended, and she approached them with head high and addressed the Duke with perfect civility, before turning to Evelyn and saying in a voice pitched to carry to every straining ear, "Miss Hartley, I hope you will forgive society's small-mindedness, for I have learned that those who criticize others' choices in love are invariably those who have never known genuine feeling themselves, and I wish you both every happiness that William and I were wise enough to seek elsewhere before dooming ourselves to mutual misery." The pronouncement from the woman who should have been the Duke's wife, delivered with such pointed criticism of their critics, created a ripple of discomfort among those who had been most vocal in their condemnation, for how could they maintain their moral outrage when the supposedly wronged party herself defended the couple and openly acknowledged her own relief at the engagement's dissolution? The remainder of the evening passed in an atmosphere of cautious reassessment, as some members of society began to reconsider their hasty judgments, while others remained entrenched in their disapproval. But Evelyn felt something shift within herself as she sat beside the Duke, watching the opera's tragic conclusion, understanding that she had survived the gauntlet of society's worst cruelty and emerged still standing, still loved, still worthy of the happiness she had once thought forever beyond her reach. And when the final curtain fell, and the Duke raised her hand to his lips in full view of the entire assembly, she met the curious stares with quiet dignity. No longer the frightened companion, but a woman who had chosen love, despite the cost, and would not apologize for that choice to anyone. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in winter's crystalline beauty, transforming London into something from a fairy tale, with snow blanketing the streets and rooftops in pristine white, and the scandal that had burned so fiercely through the autumn months had settled into an uneasy equilibrium, some quarters of society offering grudging acceptance, while others maintained their rigid condemnation. But the Duke and Evelyn had learned to navigate these treacherous social waters with increasing confidence, finding strength in their united front against judgment, and discovering that love could indeed survive even the harshest scrutiny. The Duke asked Evelyn that evening to accompany him to the garden, the same garden where they had walked together on that unseasonably warm October day that felt like a lifetime ago, though barely more than a year had passed, and she wrapped herself in a thick cloak against the cold, while he led her down paths, now transformed by snow into something magical and otherworldly. The bare branches overhead etched against a sky where the first stars had begun to emerge. They walked in companionable silence at first, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air, until they reached the stone bench, where they had once sat together before pulling away from the dangerous intimacy of almost touching, and the Duke turned to face her with an expression that was equal parts nervous and determined, his aristocratic features softened by emotion in the moonlight that reflected off the snow-covered landscape. He took both her hands in his and began to speak, his words tumbling out not as the formal proposal of a duke to his chosen bride, but as a plea from one wounded soul to another, a promise woven from all the truths they had discovered together during these months of trial and transformation. And he painted for her a vision of their future, not the grand social triumphs that his position should guarantee, but something far more precious, a life built on genuine feeling and mutual respect, on intellectual companionship and tender affection, on the courage to choose each other despite every reason society offered to choose otherwise. He spoke of the children they might have, the home they would build together, the quiet happiness possible when two people committed themselves fully to love rather than obligation, and Evelyn listened with tears streaming down her cheeks, as he promised to honor her not just as his duchess, but as his equal, his partner, his dearest friend, to shield her from cruelty when possible, and stand beside her when it was not, to build with her a marriage founded on all the things his first engagement had lacked: honesty, passion, and genuine care for each other's happiness and well-being. Then he produced from his pocket a ring, not the ostentatious diamond that society would expect, but a simple band of gold set with a single sapphire, old and slightly worn, and he explained that it had belonged to his grandmother, the only marriage in his family's recent history that had been founded on love rather than strategic alliance, and he asked Evelyn not if she would marry him, but if she would build this life with him, face whatever trials came together, dare to believe that their love could create something beautiful despite its unconventional origins. Her answer came not in words at first, but in the way she stepped into his embrace, her trembling voice finally managing to say, yes, she would marry him. She would stand beside him. She would trust in the future they could build together, and she made her own vows there in the snow-covered garden to honor the courage he had shown in choosing her, to support his happiness as he had supported hers, and to never let him regret the sacrifices he had made for their love. He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly, and then he kissed her for the first time, gentle and reverent as though she were something precious and fragile, and she kissed him back with all the love she had been forced to suppress for so long, and above them, in the window of her chambers, Lady Beatrice stood watching with tears of joy streaming down her weathered cheeks, grateful to have lived long enough to see her nephew find the happiness that had eluded so many of their family, knowing that she had played her small part in bringing these two wounded souls together and giving them the courage to choose love over duty, genuine feeling over empty obligation, and the future over the suffocating weight of the past. The months between the Christmas Eve engagement and their planned May wedding unfolded like the gradual awakening of spring itself, each week bringing new growth and transformation as winter's harshness slowly yielded to gentler seasons, and Evelyn found herself living a life she had never dared imagine during those early days as Lady Beatrice's paid companion, when she had believed happiness forever beyond her reach. The Duke insisted on a modest ceremony, understanding that grand social spectacle would only invite the scrutiny and criticism they had worked so hard to weather, and so they planned an intimate gathering in the small chapel on the Ashford estate, limiting their guest list to those who had remained loyal through the scandal. Lady Beatrice, of course, Lady Caroline and her naval officer William, a handful of the Duke's childhood friends who valued character over convention, and several members of Evelyn's own family who had maintained contact, despite her reduced circumstances, and now rejoiced at her extraordinary elevation. The preparations themselves became a series of precious moments that revealed how profoundly their relationship had shifted from those early days of careful formality and suppressed longing, for now they moved through decisions about flowers and music, and guest accommodations with easy collaboration, the Duke soliciting Evelyn's opinions, not from obligation, but from genuine desire to create a day that reflected both their tastes and values. They travelled together to Bond Street, where the Duke insisted on commissioning her trousseau from the finest modistes, despite Evelyn's protests about extravagance, and he sat patiently through endless fittings, offering opinions on fabrics and colours with an attention to detail that touched her deeply, understanding that each gown represented not merely clothing, but his desire to see her adorned as befitted her new station, and to erase through silk and satin the years of making do with threadbare gowns and altered hand-me-downs. In April, he took her to meet the tenants on his country estate, introducing her not as his betrothed, but as his partner in the responsibilities of stewardship, and Evelyn discovered an unexpected aptitude for the practical concerns of estate management, her education and natural intelligence, finding new application in discussions of crop rotations and tenant welfare, and the Duke watched her engage with his tenants' concerns with pride evident in every glance, grateful to have found a wife who would be true companion in all aspects of his life, rather than merely decorative addition to his household. Yet even as they built this future together, reminders of society's lingering disapproval intruded into their happiness like persistent weeds in an otherwise flourishing garden, for invitations to certain houses never arrived, and several families whose friendship the Duke had valued made clear through pointed silence that they would not acknowledge his marriage to a woman they considered beneath his station. These rejections stung Evelyn more than she cared to admit. Each declined invitation or cut direct a reminder that some doors would remain forever closed, regardless of the Duke's devotion or her own worthiness, but he met each instance of cruelty with unwavering support, his hand finding hers whenever society's judgment threatened to overwhelm her courage, his whispered reassurances teaching her slowly to trust that their love could indeed withstand whatever obstacles remained, and in those moments when doubt crept into her heart, he would remind her of how far they had already travelled together. From that rain-soaked afternoon when she had first arrived at Ashford House to this spring season, filled with promise and possibility, and his absolute certainty in their future, became the foundation upon which she built her own growing confidence that she could indeed become the Duchess of Ashford, not merely in title but in truth, worthy of the position not through birth or fortune, but through the strength of character that had carried her through poverty and loss, and now prepared her to stand beside the man she loved, as they faced whatever trials marriage and society might yet bring. The morning of their wedding dawned with such perfection that it seemed nature itself had conspired to bless their union, the May sky stretching cloudless and brilliant above the Ashford estate, while birdsong filled the air with music more beautiful than any cathedral choir could produce, and Evelyn woke in her chambers with a heart so full of joy and anticipation that she could scarcely believe this day had finally arrived, after all the months of scandal and doubt, all the obstacles that had threatened to keep them apart forever. Lady Beatrice came to help her dress, her aged hands surprisingly steady as she fastened the tiny pearl buttons running down the back of Evelyn's gown, a confection of ivory silk and Brussels lace that transformed the former paid companion into something radiant and otherworldly, and the elderly woman's eyes shone with unshed tears as she placed the simple coronet of orange blossoms in Evelyn's dark hair, whispering that she had never seen a more beautiful bride or one more deserving of happiness after enduring such trials with grace and dignity. The small chapel on the estate grounds had been decorated with armfuls of spring flowers, their fragrance filling the ancient stone space with sweetness, and as Evelyn walked down the short aisle on Lady Beatrice's arm, she saw the Duke waiting for her at the altar, with an expression of such profound emotion that her own eyes filled with tears, his aristocratic features no longer severe but transformed by love into something tender and vulnerable, and she understood in that moment that whatever challenges might yet come, they would face them together as equals, as partners, as two souls who had chosen each other against all reason and convention. The ceremony itself unfolded with traditional solemnity, the elderly vicar speaking the ancient words that had bound countless couples before them, but Evelyn heard beneath the familiar phrases deeper meanings forged through all they had endured together, and when the Duke spoke his vows, his voice broke with emotion as he promised to love and cherish her, to honor her not merely as his Duchess, but as his dearest companion, and her own responses came steady and clear, her earlier uncertainty replaced by absolute conviction that this man, this moment, this marriage represented everything she had dared to hope for during those dark months when happiness seemed forever beyond her reach. The moment when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife brought visible relief washing across the Duke's features, as though he had feared, even at this final instant, that something might snatch away their hard-won joy, and when he kissed her, it was with reverence and tenderness, and a promise of all the years stretching before them, filled with love and partnership and the quiet happiness possible when two people committed themselves fully to each, the other's well-being. The wedding breakfast that followed in the great hall was intimate and genuine, filled with the laughter of true friends rather than the forced gaiety of society spectacles, and Lady Caroline raised her glass in a toast that acknowledged the unconventional nature of their romance, while celebrating the courage both bride and groom had shown in choosing love over duty. And as Evelyn looked around the table at the small gathering of those who had remained loyal through scandal and judgment, she felt overwhelming gratitude for this new family she had found, this place where she finally belonged. Later that afternoon, as they prepared to depart for their honeymoon in the Lake District, the Duke handed her into the waiting carriage with the same careful attention he had shown since that snowy Christmas Eve proposal, and as they drove away from Ashford House, with the well-wishes of their guests ringing in their ears, Evelyn leaned against her husband's shoulder and allowed herself finally to believe that the frightened, impoverished gentlewoman who had arrived at this house seeking merely survival had found instead something infinitely more precious, and the Duke pressed a kiss to her temple and whispered that their real journey was only just beginning, that every day forward would be a gift they gave each other, and as the countryside unfolded before them in all its spring glory, both understood that they were leaving behind not merely a wedding celebration, but the weight of their former lives, setting out together toward a future built on genuine feeling rather than obligation, on partnership rather than pretense, on the radical courage required to choose love even when society demanded otherwise. The Lake District unfolded before them in all its summer magnificence, the mountains rising against impossibly blue skies, while crystalline lakes reflected clouds and sunshine in patterns that shifted with every passing hour. And in this landscape of wild beauty, far from London's drawing rooms and society's judgment, the Duke and his new Duchess discovered what marriage could be when built upon genuine affection rather than duty or convenience. When two people committed themselves not merely to legal contract, but to the vulnerable work of truly knowing another soul. They had taken a modest cottage rather than grander accommodations, wanting simplicity and privacy for these first weeks together, and Evelyn found herself waking each morning to the unfamiliar luxury of happiness, the Duke's sleeping form beside her, a constant reminder that all the fear and uncertainty had led finally to this peaceful haven where she could simply be herself without pretense or performance. Their days established a gentle rhythm that felt like the most natural thing in the world. Mornings spent exploring the footpaths, winding through valleys filled with wildflowers, the Duke pointing out geological formations and plant species with the same intellectual enthusiasm he had shown during those early library conversations, while Evelyn contributed her own observations, their dialogue flowing as easily as it had when propriety still separated them, yet now enriched by the physical intimacy of marriage, his hand holding hers as they navigated rocky terrain, and his arm around her shoulders when the wind blew cold off the peaks. Afternoons often found them reading in companionable silence, stretched on blankets beside whichever lake they had wandered to that day, and Evelyn marveled at how completely the Duke's severity had dissolved in the warmth of their shared life, his laughter coming readily now, his smiles frequent and unguarded, and she understood that the austere man who had first greeted her at Ashford House had been merely a shell, protecting wounds too deep to expose to a world that valued duty over feeling. In the evenings they talked for hours, sharing not just ideas but the intimate details of their inner lives, and the Duke spoke of his childhood loneliness, the way his father's expectations had shaped him into something cold and distant, while Evelyn revealed the full extent of her family's tragedy, the years of making do with less and less, the constant fear of complete destitution, and in sharing these private griefs they built between them a foundation of understanding that transformed their marriage from legal arrangement into true partnership. Letters arrived weekly from Lady Beatrice, her elegant script bringing news of London society, how certain families who had condemned their marriage most vociferously were now quietly suggesting perhaps they had been too hasty in judgment, how others remained stubbornly opposed but found their influence waning, as younger members of the ton proved more accepting of unconventional matches. Yet these reports felt distant and unimportant compared to the immediate reality of their happiness, and together they made a conscious decision to build their life around their own values rather than society's fluctuating approval, understanding that true contentment came not from external validation, but from the daily choice to honor and cherish each other, regardless of what others might think. By the time late summer began its slow surrender to autumn, both had shed layers of fear and self-protection they had carried for years. Evelyn, no longer the anxious woman convinced her very existence was an imposition, the Duke no longer the severe aristocrat imprisoned by expectations, and as they prepared finally to return to Ashford House, they did so not with trepidation, but with quiet confidence that, whatever challenges awaited, they would face them together as equals, as partners, as two people who had found in each other not merely romantic love, but the deeper gift of genuine companionship. Autumn returned to Ashford House with the same golden light that had illuminated those early days when Evelyn first arrived as a frightened paid companion. But now the estate seemed transformed by an invisible alchemy, the very stones warmed by the love that permeated every room, and as the Duke handed his wife down from their carriage after months away, both felt not the anxiety of returning to a place of former pain, but the deep satisfaction of coming home to a life they had built together against all opposition and expectation. Evelyn stepped into her new role as Duchess with a confidence that would have astonished her former self, that uncertain woman who had once tried to make herself invisible in these very halls, and she discovered that her own experiences of precarious circumstance had given her both empathy and practical knowledge that she could now employ to help others, establishing a discreet fund to assist gentlewomen fallen on hard times, offering positions within the household to those who might otherwise face destitution, and using her influence quietly but effectively to create pathways for women whose choices had been narrowed by society's rigid expectations. The Duke himself seemed to embody transformation made visible, his earlier severity replaced by an ease and openness that delighted everyone who encountered him, and the estate thrived under his engaged attention, for a man no longer burdened by emotional repression could bring his full intelligence and energy to the work of stewardship, his tenants remarking among themselves that his grace had become almost unrecognizable from the distant, austere figure who had managed them with cold efficiency rather than genuine care. Lady Beatrice, grown more frail with each passing season yet still sharp of mind and tongue, watched her nephew's happiness with profound contentment, understanding that her own final years were graced by the joy of seeing the transformation she had hoped for since his boyhood, when his father's harsh expectations had begun building walls around a naturally warm and curious nature. Their first dinner party as a married couple became a quiet celebration of loyalty and genuine affection. The small gathering, including only those who had remained steadfast through scandal and judgment, and as Evelyn presided over her own table with natural grace, engaging each guest in conversation that revealed her quick mind and warm heart, the Duke found himself watching her with wonder that this remarkable woman had chosen to bind her life to his, despite every reason for caution and self-protection. The evening unfolded with easy laughter and comfortable conversation, the kind of gathering where people could speak their true thoughts without fear of judgment or social calculation, and the household staff, moving quietly through their duties, exchanged satisfied glances that confirmed what they had hoped during those difficult months, that their master and new mistress had found in each other something rare and precious, a partnership built on genuine regard rather than duty or convention. Later, when their guests had departed and the house settled into nighttime quiet, the Duke and Evelyn retreated to the library that had been the setting for so many pivotal moments in their relationship, and sitting together by the fire, with his arm around her shoulders and her head resting against him in perfect trust, they reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them from those first careful conversations to this moment of complete belonging, understanding that every obstacle they had faced, every moment of doubt and fear, had served somehow to deepen their appreciation for the happiness they now possessed. And as the flames cast dancing shadows across walls lined with books, both knew with absolute certainty that in choosing each other, they had chosen not merely romantic love, but the profound gift of being truly known by another soul, of being seen in all their complexity, and cherished, not despite their flaws and fears, but in full acknowledgement of everything they were and might yet become together. 5 years had passed since that autumn return to Ashford House, 5 years during which the transformation of both the Duke and his Duchess had deepened into something permanent and unshakable, and now the library that had witnessed so many pivotal moments in their relationship echoed with entirely different sounds. The high, sweet laughter of twin daughters who played with wooden toys upon the very carpet where their parents had once conducted careful, proper conversations, weighted with unspoken longing and impossible desire. Lady Beatrice sat in her accustomed chair by the window, her body grown fragile with the accumulation of years, yet her eyes still bright with intelligence and satisfaction as she watched her great nieces, Charlotte and Eleanor, tumble about with the unself-conscious joy of children raised in an atmosphere of genuine affection rather than cold propriety, and she reflected with deep contentment that she had lived long enough to see not merely her nephew's happiness, but its flowering into this beautiful family that filled Ashford House with warmth and life. Evelyn, no longer the anxious paid companion who had once moved through these halls trying to make herself invisible, sat with her daughters helping them build towers from blocks, is her confidence and grace so natural now that it seemed impossible she had ever been anything but the Duchess. Yet those who had known her from the beginning understood that her transformation had been earned through courage and persistence, through the daily choice to believe herself worthy of love, despite society's initial condemnation. And the work she continued with vulnerable women had become her particular passion, a legacy of compassion born from her own experience of precarious circumstance. The Duke himself, reading in his favorite chair yet frequently interrupted by small hands, demanding his attention for some urgent, childish concern, bore no resemblance whatsoever to the severe, emotionally distant aristocrat who had once governed this household with rigid formality, and watching him laugh at his daughter's antics, Seeing the easy affection with which he pulled Evelyn close when she came to sit beside him, one could only marvel at the complete dissolution of those protective walls he had maintained for so many years, understanding that true love had accomplished what duty and expectation never could, releasing him into the fullness of his own warm and generous nature. The portrait recently commissioned hung above the mantelpiece, showing the four of them together in this very room, the artist having captured something essential in their expressions and postures, the visible evidence of mutual devotion and belonging that made the painting more than mere representation, transforming it into testimony of what they had built together against all opposition and doubt, and visitors invariably commented on the unusual warmth radiating from the canvas, the sense that this family had found something rare and precious in one another. Dear listener, as we take our leave of the Duke and Duchess in their library, surrounded by the life and love they have created, let us reflect on what their journey reveals about the cages we construct for ourselves, the ways we surrender to fear and expectation rather than daring to reach for happiness, and consider whether the price of safety might sometimes be too high when it requires us to abandon our deepest truths and most authentic longings. Their story whispers to us across the years that transformation is possible even when circumstances seem impossibly constrained, that courage to choose love over fear can create ripples of change extending far beyond our individual lives, and that patience combined with persistence can gradually wear away even the most formidable obstacles between our present reality and our heart's desire. If you find yourself trapped in some cage of your own making, convinced that duty or propriety or fear must dictate the boundaries of your existence, remember Evelyn's journey from frightened companion to confident duchess, the Duke's metamorphosis from severe isolation to abundant life, and dare to ask yourself what might be possible if you summoned the courage to reach beyond the limitations you have accepted as immutable. May you find the strength to break free from whatever confines you, the wisdom to recognize genuine love when it appears even in unexpected forms, and the patience to build happiness through accumulated small choices rather than demanding immediate transformation. And may you rest tonight knowing that your own story, whatever its current chapter, still holds possibility for beauty and redemption beyond anything you can currently imagine. For the human heart possesses remarkable resilience and capacity for renewal when given permission to hope and courage to act upon that hope, and may peace attend your journey wherever it may lead. This has been a story from our channel, and if these words have touched your heart or offered comfort in your own struggles, we invite you to subscribe and join our community of listeners who find solace and inspiration in tales of transformation, redemption, and the enduring power of love to heal even the deepest wounds.